Harland Avalace thought the hardest part of that storm was choosing between buying dinner for his daughter or stopping for a stranded stranger. Then he opened an old woman's Cadillac and found a wire that hadn't worn out. It had been cut with surgical precision. Hours later, her billionaire CEO daughter called to accuse him of touching the car, and Harland quietly answered with 7 words that made her world collapse. "Your mother's car didn't break down. Someone wanted it to." If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I've got another unforgettable story coming your way soon. Before we jump back in, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and who's listening from around the world. Now, let's get back to the story. Harland Avalace heard the storm before he saw it, a low roll of thunder that rattled the tin roof of his garage like someone was dragging furniture across it. By the time he locked up and climbed into his truck, the rain was coming down sideways, hard enough that his wipers could barely keep up. He had $11 folded into his back pocket, maybe enough for a can of soup and something for his daughter's lunchbox tomorrow. Definitely not enough for both. He drove slow, both hands on the wheel, watching the yellow line disappear and reappear through the water sheeting across his windshield. The road out past the county line didn't have much on it this time of night. A gas station with its lights off, a church with a crooked sign, and then, up ahead, hazard lights blinking through the downpour. An old powder blue Cadillac sat crooked on the shoulder, hood still closed, and a woman stood beside it holding an umbrella that wasn't doing much against the wind. 2 cars passed her without slowing down, then a third. Harland pulled over. He didn't think about the $11. He didn't think about how tired he was, or how his daughter was probably already asleep by the time he'd get her dinner sorted out. He just grabbed the flashlight from under his seat and stepped out into the rain like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Ma'am, you need some help?" She looked at him careful at first, the way people do when a stranger stops for them on an empty road. Then something in her face eased. "I'd appreciate it. She just quit on me." Her name was Janet. She talked while he worked, telling him about the Cadillac like it was an old friend. Said her husband had bought it for her the year they got married. Said she'd never had the heart to trade it in, even after everybody told her to. Harland half listened, popping the hood, running his flashlight over the engine, checking the battery terminals first, because that was usually the easy answer. It wasn't the battery. He worked his way down, methodical, the way he'd been trained to years ago, in a life he didn't talk about anymore. Rain dripped off his nose and soaked through his shirt, but his hands stayed steady, moving the way they always did when something didn't add up yet. Then he found it. Tucked back near the firewall, half hidden under years of road grime, was a wire that had been cut. Not frayed, not corroded. Cut clean, at an angle that didn't happen by accident and didn't happen from age. Somebody had done this on purpose, and they'd done it carefully enough that most mechanics would have missed it entirely. Harland went still for a second, rain running down the back of his neck. He didn't say anything to Janet, not yet. He rerouted the connection best he could with what he had in his truck, got the engine turning over again, and closed the hood. "That should get you home," he said. Janet reached for her purse before he even finished the sentence. "Let me pay you something, please." "No, ma'am, wouldn't feel right, you stranded out here in this weather, and me charging you for 5 minutes of work." "It was more than 5 minutes. Then I guess I lost track." She tried twice more, and both times he shook his head. Eventually she just looked at him a long moment, like she was trying to memorize his face, and said, "Not many people would have stopped tonight." "Wasn't hard, ma'am. You needed help." She drove off into the rain, taillights fading down the dark stretch of highway, and Harland stood there by his truck a minute longer than he needed to, thinking about that wire, about how somebody had gotten underneath that hood before he ever did, about how somebody wanted that car to fail, and had made sure it would happen somewhere quiet, somewhere nobody would think twice about an old woman broken down on the side of the road. He didn't have an answer for it, not yet. So he got back in his truck and drove home, because that's what a man does when he's got a daughter waiting on him, answers or not. He didn't get to sleep until well past midnight, and even then it wasn't really sleep, just lying there running that wire over and over in his mind. The garage phone rang a little after 10. Harland almost let it go. Nobody called the shop line that late unless it was trouble, and he'd had enough trouble in his life to last 2 lifetimes already. But something made him pick it up. This is Harland. I need to know why you were putting your hands on my mother's car tonight. The voice on the other end was sharp. No hello, no warm-up. Harland could hear traffic behind her, like she was pacing somewhere outside. Ma'am, I'm not sure who you... Leslie Johnson. Janet Johnson is my mother. She told me a mechanic stopped and fixed her car for free, and I want to know what you were actually doing under that hood. Harland let the accusation sit there a second before he answered, because he understood something she didn't yet. This wasn't about gratitude. This was about protection. A daughter scared for her mother, throwing suspicion at the nearest stranger because it was easier than fear. I was doing exactly what your mother needed me to do, he said quietly. But there's something you should know. That car didn't break down on its own. What are you talking about? Harland looked out the rain-streaked window of his garage, thinking about that clean, deliberate cut hidden where nobody would ever think to look. Your mother's car didn't break down, he said. Someone wanted it to. If a man can lose almost everything and still pull over for a stranger in the pouring rain, the least the rest of us can do is stick around long enough to see where this goes. Hit subscribe now, because Harland didn't ask for anything back tonight, and he's about to need people in his corner more than he knows. Leslie Johnson didn't sleep after that phone call, and by the time the sun came up over the tree line, she was already parked outside a garage that looked like it had been standing there since the 70s, rust bleeding down the corrugated siding, a hand-painted sign reading Aviles Auto Repair, swinging slightly in the wind. 2 men in dark jackets got out of the SUV behind her before she did. Harland saw them coming through the front window and set down the wrench he'd been holding. He'd dealt with plenty of difficult customers over the years, but something about the way these 3 walked, like they already knew how this conversation was going to end, told him this was different. The woman leading them was younger than he expected. Tailored suit, soaked heels from crossing the gravel lot, and a look on her face like she'd already made up her mind about him before she said a word. You're Harland Aviles. That's right. Leslie Johnson. She didn't offer a hand. We spoke last night. We did. She glanced around the shop, at the stacked tires and the coffee can full of loose bolts, and Harland could see her doing the math, sizing him up against whatever she'd expected to find. I want to know what you're after. Money, obviously. Some kind of settlement. Maybe you're hoping my mother feels guilty enough to write you a check. Harland didn't raise his voice. He never did. Not when people came at him like this. He'd learned a long time ago that getting loud only ever made things worse. Ma'am, I didn't take a dime from your mother last night, and I'm not looking to take one from you either. Everyone says that right before they ask for one. Then I guess I'll be the first exception you've met. One of the men behind her shifted his weight, arms crossed, watching Harland like he expected him to make a move. Harland ignored him. He'd been stared down by better men than that, back when he still wore a badge with his name on it, and sat in rooms full of executives who talked about him like he wasn't there. Leslie folded her arms. So convince me. Tell me exactly what you think you found under that car, and why I should believe a roadside mechanic over my own security team, who inspected that vehicle 3 months ago and found nothing wrong with it. I can do better than telling you, Harland said. Bring it back around, let me show you. She hesitated only a second before nodding toward one of the men, who radioed something, and 10 minutes later the Cadillac rolled up the gravel drive with Janet in the passenger seat, looking equal parts curious and worried. Janet got out slower than the others, leaning on the door for balance, and the moment she saw Harland her whole face changed. There he is. That's the young man I told you about. Mom, please, let me handle this. Handle what? He fixed my car in the pouring rain and wouldn't take $1 for it. I tried 3 times. Leslie's jaw tightened at that, like it was the first piece of information that didn't fit the story she'd built overnight. She looked at Harland again, this time with something closer to doubt than accusation. Harland popped the hood without being asked and waved them closer. Right here. He pointed the flashlight at the wire near the firewall, the same one from the night before, patched now with the makeshift fix he'd managed on the shoulder of the road. This isn't wear and tear. Wear and tear phrase. It splits unevenly, usually right at a stress point where the wire's been rubbing against something for years. This was cut. Straight line, clean edges, positioned exactly where it'd cause the engine to lose power gradually, instead of cutting out all at once. Meaning whoever did this didn't want her stranded 5 minutes after she left her driveway. They wanted the failure to happen somewhere down the road, somewhere unpredictable. Janet's hand went to her mouth. "I don't understand. Who would want to hurt me?" "I don't know, ma'am, but I know this wasn't luck, and I know it wasn't age. Somebody with real knowledge of these engines did this on purpose." Leslie stood there a long moment, arms still folded, but the certainty had drained out of her posture. She looked at her mother, then back at Harland, like she was recalculating everything she'd assumed walking in. "My security team cleared this car 3 months ago. Then either they missed it, or it happened after they looked." "That's not possible. Nobody's touched this car since it left our garage." Harlan didn't answer that right away. He'd learned not to argue with people about what was or wasn't possible until he had something solid enough to stand on. Instead, he reached for a socket wrench off his bench. "Ma'am, would you mind if I looked a little further? Where there's one thing like that hidden, there's usually more." Leslie hesitated, glancing at her mother, who nodded before she could answer for herself. It took him 20 minutes, working carefully through the wiring harness and down along the fuel line, checking connections most people would never think to check. Leslie watched without saying much, arms uncrossed now, leaning against the hood of her own SUV, like the fight had gone out of her. Then Harland found the second one, a sensor wire near the fuel system, spliced and rerouted so subtly that unless someone was looking for exactly the kind of damage he'd already found once, they'd never catch it. He stood up slow, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked at Leslie with an expression that wasn't triumphant, just tired and certain. This wasn't some kid messing around, and it wasn't random vandalism, he said. Whoever did this knew engineering, real engineering, the kind you don't pick up watching videos online. Leslie's face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. "How sure are you?" Harland closed the hood gently, like he was closing a door on something he didn't want to open again, but knew he had to. "Sure enough that I think somebody inside your company already knows exactly what's wrong with this car." Leslie didn't say much on the drive to Johnson Automotive, just kept glancing at Harland in the rearview mirror like she was still trying to decide if she'd made a mistake bringing him along. Janet had stayed behind at the garage, insisting she was fine, insisting somebody needed to keep an eye on things, while the men figured out what needed figuring out. Harland hadn't argued. He'd learned a long time ago that some battles weren't his to fight. The headquarters sat behind a wall of glass and steel that caught the morning sun in a way that made the whole building look like it was made of ice. Harland felt the stares before he even got out of the car. Security guards, receptionists. A man in a gray suit who looked at his boots like they'd tracked something in from outside, which, in fairness, they probably had. Leslie led him up to the 12th floor without much conversation, into a glass-walled conference room where 3 executives were already waiting, coffee cups in front of them, expressions arranged somewhere between polite and skeptical. "This is the mechanic I mentioned," Leslie said, and Harlan caught the way she said it, like she was already regretting the word choice. A man near the head of the table, silver-haired, expensive watch, didn't bother standing. The one from the roadside. "That's right," Harlan said. "And you found what, exactly? A worn hose, a loose clamp, a deliberately cut wire, and a second modification on the fuel sensor line, both hidden well enough that your team's last inspection missed them entirely." The man exchanged a look with the woman beside him, the kind of look people give each other when they've already decided something isn't worth taking seriously. "With respect, sir, our engineers have decades of combined experience. I find it difficult to believe a shade tree mechanic caught something they didn't." Harlan kept his voice even. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to look at the car yourselves." Leslie cut in before it could go further, sliding a folder across the table. "I want you to walk him through the diagnostic reports on the new SUV platform. All of them, going back 6 months. The silver-haired man frowned. "Leslie, that's proprietary information. And he's not an employee. I know. He's also the only person who's found anything real in the last 24 hours. So either we use that, or we keep pretending there isn't a problem. Harlan sat down across from the reports as they were reluctantly slid toward him, and for the first time since walking in, something in his chest tightened that had nothing to do with the cold looks around the table. The formatting was different, the branding was different, but the underlying architecture of the diagnostic code was something he recognized down to the bone. He'd seen structures like this before, years ago, in a life he didn't talk about with anyone, back when his signature still meant something on an engineering sign-off sheet. He flipped through page after page, watching the same pattern repeat itself in different systems. Intermittent failures logged as random, sensor readings that didn't quite match component specs, small, isolated glitches that on their own meant nothing, but stacked together told a very specific story if you knew what you were looking at. These failures, he said slowly, they're not random. That's what our engineers concluded independently, actually, the woman across the table said, arms folded. Manufacturing variance happens at this scale. No, Harlan said. This isn't variance. This is intentional, and it's designed to look like variance. The room went quiet in a different way than before. 15 years ago, in a different building not unlike this one, Harlan had sat across a similar table, telling a similar group of executives that a vehicle program wasn't safe, that the software governing certain fail-safes had a pattern he didn't trust, and that he wouldn't sign off on it no matter how far behind schedule it put the launch. 3 weeks later, he was called into a different room entirely, told that confidential engineering files had gone missing from his terminal, and that the company's investigation had concluded he was responsible. He remembered the exact words: dishonest, unreliable, a liability the company couldn't retain. He remembered how fast the story spread once it left that room, how job offers dried up within a month, how his wife had tried to hold on for a while longer than either of them expected before the strain of watching everything collapse finally broke something between them that never mended. He remembered holding his daughter on nights when the shop still didn't have enough customers to keep the lights on, promising her things would get better, not entirely sure if he believed it himself. He hadn't touched engineering software like this in over a decade. And now, here it was again, dressed up in a different company's branding, running the same kind of quiet sabotage he'd once tried to stop and been destroyed for noticing. "You all right?" Leslie asked, watching him a little too closely. Harlan closed the folder slower than he needed to, buying himself a second to steady his voice. "I've seen this before." "Seen what before?" "This exact kind of manipulation. Years ago. Different company, different vehicle, but the same fingerprints, right down to how they hide the pattern inside data nobody thinks to cross-reference." The silver-haired executive leaned forward, some of his condescension slipping into something closer to unease. "And where exactly did you see this?" Harlan looked up at him, and for the first time since walking into that building, he let something harder show through. "I saw it right before it ended my career." Somebody made sure of that. Nobody in the room said anything for a long moment. "Whoever did this to your mother's car," Harlan said quietly, turning to Leslie, "isn't some outsider looking to cause trouble. This is somebody who already knows how to make a company believe a lie. And I think whoever it is has done it before." The silver-haired executive's name was Whitfield Marsh, and after that meeting broke apart in a haze of unanswered questions, Leslie pulled Harlan aside in the hallway, instead of walking him back out to the lobby like everyone clearly expected her to. "I need you to look at something," she said, "but it can't happen in that room." "Why not?" "Because I don't know who in that room I can trust yet, and until I do, I'd rather keep this between us." She took him down 2 floors to a smaller office with the blinds drawn, empty, except for a workstation and a stack of external drives she pulled from a locked cabinet, like she'd been waiting for a reason to open it. "Prototype diagnostics," she explained. "The full failure logs from the new electric SUV platform, the one set to launch in front of investors and press in a matter of weeks. Nothing scrubbed for a boardroom, raw data, straight from the vehicles themselves." "This doesn't leave this room," she said. "If Marsh finds out I gave a contractor access to this, it's not just my job. It could tank the launch before we even understand what we're dealing with. I'm not a contractor. You will be by the time we're done here. I'll make sure of it." She said it without much warmth, more like she was solving a logistics problem than doing him a favor, and Harland respected that more than he would have respected sympathy. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and somewhere around hour 3, Leslie stopped hovering over his shoulder and just let him work, bringing him coffee once without being asked, which he took as its own kind of trust. The pattern took shape slowly, then all at once. Every failure logged as random turned out to share a signature buried 3 layers beneath where anyone would normally look. Something so specific it couldn't have happened by accident. A sensor here, a firmware delay there. Nothing severe enough on its own to trip a safety alert, but together forming a countdown. He mapped the timestamps against the internal launch calendar and felt something cold settle in his stomach. Leslie. She looked up from across the room, where she'd been quietly working through her own stack of internal reports. These failures aren't random, and they're not spread out evenly either. They cluster. He turned the monitor toward her. Look at the dates. Every one of these gets slightly worse, slightly more likely to trigger, the closer you get to a specific window. What window? 3 weeks from now. He didn't need to check the calendar on the wall to know what was happening in 3 weeks. Everyone in that building already knew. Your launch event. Leslie went very still. You're telling me somebody built failures into these vehicles that get worse, right up until the day we unveil them in front of every major outlet in the country. I'm telling you the code is written to behave normally until it isn't, and it stops behaving normally on a schedule that matches your launch almost exactly. That's not possible. These vehicles have been through 18 months of testing. They've been through 18 months of testing that didn't know what to look for. I only caught it because I've seen this exact kind of dormant failure logic before. He didn't elaborate on where, not yet, and she didn't ask. Too busy staring at the screen, like it might rearrange itself into something less catastrophic if she looked hard enough. If this triggers during the launch, she said slowly, in front of live cameras, in front of every investor we've spent 2 years courting, your stock cratering wouldn't be an accident. It'd be the point. Leslie sat down across from him, pressing her palms flat against the desk, like she needed something solid to hold on to. Somebody wants this company to fail publicly. Somebody wants this company weak enough that whoever's waiting on the other side of that failure can walk in and buy up what's left of it for a fraction of what it's worth. Harland had seen the shape of this kind of thing before, distantly, in boardroom rumors from his old life. Companies gutted just enough to make an acquisition look like a rescue instead of a takeover. This isn't sabotage for the sake of sabotage. This is somebody clearing a path. Leslie didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had lost the sharp edge from that morning, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. My father built this company from nothing. If this happens the way you're describing, I could lose it in a single afternoon, in front of the entire country. Harland didn't offer her comfort he didn't have to give. Instead, he went back to the files, cross-referencing the engineering signatures against internal authorization records, looking for whoever had access to write code this deep into the system without tripping any red flags. It took another hour of quiet, methodical work before a name surfaced in the access logs, buried under a title that meant almost nothing to him, until he scrolled up and saw the committee it was attached to. An internal investigation, 15 years old, filed under a case number he still remembered without ever wanting to. His own case. Harland sat back slowly, staring at the name on the screen, like it might change if he looked away and looked back. "What is it?" Leslie asked, noticing the shift in him immediately. He didn't answer for a moment, because saying it out loud made it real in a way that scared him more than he expected. "This name," he finally said, turning the monitor toward her, "sat on the committee that destroyed my career 15 years ago. And right now, he has access to the exact kind of system manipulation that's about to destroy yours." Leslie stared at the screen for a long moment, before she finally looked up at Harland. "You're certain? I've had 15 years to memorize every name from that committee. I don't need to check twice." She didn't say anything right away, just closed the folder in front of her like shutting it might slow down what they'd just found. Then she picked up her phone and made a call Harland didn't fully hear, something quiet and clipped about pulling personnel records. about needing them by end of day, no explanations given. Harlan drove back to his garage that evening with more questions than he'd started the day with, and none of the peace he'd hoped might come from finally understanding what he was up against. He should have known better than to expect peace. Trouble like this didn't wait politely while a man figured out how to handle it. By the next morning, it had already found him. He noticed it first in the empty parking lot. 3 regular customers who usually came by before work nowhere to be seen. Then the phone started ringing, not with new business, but with people canceling appointments they'd made weeks earlier. Voices apologetic but firm, like they'd been told something they didn't want to repeat to his face. It was his landlord who finally said it plainly, standing in the garage doorway with a folded newspaper under his arm, and a look Harlan hadn't seen from him before. "You want to explain this?" He held out the paper, and Harlan felt something drop in his stomach before he'd even finished reading the headline. Disgraced engineer resurfaces, now working auto fraud angle against major manufacturer. The article was thin on facts and heavy on implication, quoting an unnamed source close to the company who described Harlan as a bitter former employee looking for a payout after years of failed attempts to rebuild his reputation. "It's not true," Harlan said. "None of it." "Maybe not, but my other tenants are asking questions, and I've got a business to run same as you. I've paid rent on time every month for 3 years." "I know that." The man didn't meet his eyes when he said it. "Just get current on next month early, all right? Things are tight all over." Harlan didn't argue further. He understood, even if it didn't make it hurt any less, that the article had done exactly what it was designed to do, planted just enough doubt that people would rather stay away than take the risk of being associated with whatever this was. Leslie called that afternoon, her voice tighter than he'd heard it before. "I saw the piece. I want you to know that wasn't us. I didn't think it was. I can send you our legal team. We can push back publicly. Get ahead of it before it spreads further." "I don't need lawyers, Leslie. I need people to stop believing lies before those lies cost me the shop." He didn't say it angrily, just tired, the particular tired that came from watching something be taken from him a second time using the exact same method as the first. "Let me help you. You already are helping, working this the right way. I don't need charity on top of it." She didn't argue further, though he could tell she wanted to, and instead told him something that shifted the ground beneath the whole conversation. His mother had remembered something overnight, small at first, easy to dismiss until it wasn't. A technician had come by the house nearly 2 weeks before the breakdown, someone Janet hadn't recognized, claiming to be doing a routine manufacturer check she didn't recall ever scheduling. She let him in? She said he had credentials, a company badge, a clipboard, the whole act. She didn't think twice about it. "And your security footage from the house?" "Still there. I'm having it pulled now." By that evening, the footage confirmed exactly what Harlan had already suspected, without proof. A man in a service uniform, spending nearly 40 minutes under the hood of that Cadillac, far longer than any routine inspection should have taken, working with the kind of careful, unhurried precision that told Harlan everything he needed to know about who'd trained him. That night, Harlan didn't sleep either. He sat at his workbench with a borrowed laptop and the recovered footage playing on a loop beside him, cross-referencing timestamps against the corrupted engineering files Leslie had managed to pull from deep backup storage, piecing together fragments that had clearly been meant to disappear for good. It took hours, hunched over cold coffee in a garage that smelled like motor oil, and rain that hadn't quite dried from 3 nights ago, but slowly the picture assembled itself. Authorization logs, access timestamps, a digital trail leading directly back to names that shouldn't have had any reason to be involved in either Janet's car or the SUV platform, except that they clearly did. Leslie showed up near midnight, still in the same clothes from that morning, and stood behind him reading the screen in silence for a long time. "This is enough," she finally said. "This is enough to bring to the board. It's enough to start a fight. Whether it's enough to win one is a different question." She didn't disagree. Instead, she sat down across from him, exhaustion and resolve fighting for space on her face in equal measure. and looked at the evidence they'd built together out of a stormy night that had started with nothing more than a stranded old woman on the side of the road. "Tomorrow," Harlan said quietly, closing the laptop, "they'll either destroy us or we'll expose every one of them." Janet Johnson hadn't slept either, though nobody had asked her to stay awake. She sat in the small office at the back of Johnson Automotive, hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea gone cold an hour ago, watching her daughter and a mechanic she'd known for barely 2 days work through the wreckage of a conspiracy neither of them had asked for. "There's something I should have told you both sooner," she said finally, breaking the silence that had settled over the room somewhere past midnight. Leslie looked up from the monitor, dark circles under her eyes. "Mom, whatever it is, now's the time." Janet reached into the worn leather bag she carried everywhere and pulled out a folder, yellowed at the edges, corners soft from years of handling. "Your father gave me this before he passed. Told me to keep it somewhere safe and never mention it unless things got bad enough that I had no other choice." "What is it?" "A governance agreement. Something he drafted with the board back when the company was young enough that nobody thought it would ever grow this large." Janet slid the folder across the desk with hands that shook slightly, though whether from exhaustion or memory, Harlan couldn't tell. He always worried somebody might try to take this company away from the family one day. This gives the sitting CEO emergency authority to override a board vote, but only under very specific circumstances. Leslie opened the folder carefully, scanning the first page with the particular stillness of someone reading something they never expected to need. Circumstances like what? Like if the founding family is being deliberately endangered to force a change in leadership. The room went quiet except for the hum of the building's overnight ventilation system. Harlan watched Leslie's face shift as she read further, disbelief slowly giving way to something steadier, something closer to resolve.
"This is real," Leslie said. "This is actually legally binding."
"Your father made sure of it, buried it deep enough that most people forgot it existed, but real all the same." Harlan leaned forward, studying the document's language over Leslie's shoulder, cross-referencing dates against everything they'd already recovered. "If this holds up, and if what we've found ties directly back to an attempt on your mother's safety, this could be the difference between fighting the board from a position of weakness and walking into that room with something they can't argue against." "It could be," Leslie said carefully, "if I can prove the connection cleanly enough that nobody can dismiss it as coincidence." They worked through the rest of the night, piecing exactly that connection together, cross-matching authorization logs against the technician's forged credentials, matching timestamps from the tampered Cadillac against the same signatures buried in the SUV platform's failure code. Every thread led back to the same handful of names, the same access windows, the same quiet fingerprints Harlan had first recognized from a life he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Around 3 in the morning, Leslie's phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something made her answer anyway. Harlan watched her face change within seconds, the exhaustion sharpening into something colder and more alert. She didn't say much, mostly listened, her knuckles going white around the phone. When she hung up, she didn't speak right away. "Who was that?" Harlan asked. "Somebody on the board, warning me that if I bring unverified accusations against senior leadership before the launch, I won't just lose credibility, I'll lose the company." She set the phone down slowly, like it had gotten heavier in her hand. "They know we're close to something. They wouldn't be calling otherwise. Doesn't mean they know how close. It means they're scared enough to make the call at 3 in the morning." Leslie rubbed her eyes, the fatigue of the last 2 days finally catching up with her all at once. "If I push this forward and I'm wrong about any of it, I don't just lose my job, I lose everything my father built. And if you don't push it forward," Harlan said quietly, "you already know what happens at that launch event." Janet reached over and took her daughter's hand, the gesture small but steadying. "Your father didn't build this company by being afraid of what people might say about him. He built it by doing what was right even when the room disagreed." Leslie sat with that for a long moment, staring at the folder still open in front of her, at the evidence stacked beside it in neat, damning rows. Harlan recognized the look on her face, because he'd worn it himself once, 15 years ago, standing in a boardroom deciding whether telling the truth was worth losing everything he'd worked for. He'd made that choice once already, and paid for it in ways that still followed him. He understood, watching Leslie now, exactly what she was weighing, and he understood there was nothing he could say that would make the decision lighter. "Whatever you decide," he said finally, "I'll back it, but I think you already know what you're going to do." Leslie closed the folder and stood, some of the exhaustion falling away from her posture, replaced by something firmer. "I'm calling an emergency session with the board first thing this morning. I'm bringing everything we have. They're going to come after you hard. Let them try." She looked at her mother, then at Harland, something like gratitude flickering across her face for the first time since this had all started. "My father left me a way to fight back. I'd be a coward not to use it." Outside, the first gray light of morning was starting to creep over the parking lot, and somewhere across town, Harland knew, the people responsible for all of this had no idea the ground beneath them was about to shift. If watching someone choose truth over an easy way out means anything to you, don't scroll past this one. Subscribe now, because Leslie's about to walk into a room full of people counting on her staying quiet, and the least we can do is make sure her story doesn't go unheard either. The boardroom on the top floor of Johnson Automotive had windows floor to ceiling on two sides, glass polished so clean it looked like there was nothing separating the room from open sky. Harland had never been in a place like it before, not even back when he still had a badge with his name printed under a title that meant something. He sat near the back at Leslie's request, close enough to be called forward if needed, far enough to watch the room without being the center of it. By 8 that morning, every seat at the long table was filled. Whitfield Marsh sat near the head of it, unbothered in a way that struck Harland as rehearsed, like a man who already believed he knew how the meeting would end. "This session was called on short notice," Marsh said, addressing the room without quite looking at Leslie. "I think we're all aware of why." "You're aware of what you've heard," Leslie said, standing at the far end of the table, "which isn't the same thing as what's true." "Then enlighten us." Marsh folded his hands. "Because from where several of us are sitting, our CEO has spent the last 2 days sharing confidential engineering data with an outside contractor whose own history includes accusations of stolen files and falsified records. Forgive me if that raises concern rather than confidence." A murmur moved through the room, quiet but pointed, and Harland felt the weight of every eye that flicked toward him settle somewhere heavy in his chest. He'd expected this. It didn't make it easier to sit through. "That contractor," Leslie said, "identified a deliberate act of sabotage against my mother's vehicle, and a matching pattern of intentional failure built into the SUV platform set to launch in less than 3 weeks. If either of those things reach the public before we address them, this company won't survive the fallout. I'd rather survive an uncomfortable morning than a catastrophic afternoon." "Convenient timing," said a woman near the middle of the table, someone Harland hadn't been introduced to yet. "An unverified accusation, days before launch, delivered by someone with a personal grudge against manufacturers exactly like ours." "It's not unverified," Leslie nodded toward Harland. "Show them." Harland stood, feeling every set of eyes in the room track the movement, and walked to the screen at the front, without letting his hands shake, though something in his chest wanted them to. He pulled up the diagnostic comparison first. The cut wire from Janet's Cadillac laid beside the dormant failure code buried in the SUV platform, side by side, impossible to mistake as coincidence once someone actually looked at them together. "This isn't a grudge," he said. "This is a pattern." The same engineering signature, the same method of hiding a failure inside data that looks random until you cross-reference it against a timeline. I've seen this exact kind of manipulation before, 15 years ago, in a different company, right before I was blamed for something I never did. "And that's supposed to make us trust you," Marsh said. "A man who claims he recognizes sabotage because he was once accused of committing it himself." "I'm not asking you to trust me," Harland said evenly. "I'm asking you to trust the evidence." He pulled up the security footage next, the unfamiliar technician working under Janet's hood for nearly 40 minutes on a visit nobody had scheduled. Then the authorization logs, the access records tracing directly back through layers of internal permissions to a name that made the room go very still when it appeared on the screen. Marsh's own name, buried in a system he clearly hadn't expected anyone to think to check. "This is fabricated," Marsh said, too quickly, his composure slipping in a way Harland recognized instantly. The particular panic of a man watching a lie collapse faster than he could patch it. Anyone with basic access could plant a name in a log. Then explain why your credentials also appear on the original investigation that removed me from my position 15 years ago, Harland said quietly. Same committee. Same signature style buried in the recommendation report. I didn't need to fabricate that connection, Mr. Marsh. It was already there. The room shifted, murmurs rising louder now, several board members exchanging glances that had nothing to do with confidence anymore. "This is exactly the kind of coordinated smear I warned this board about," Marsh said, standing now, voice sharper. A disgraced engineer and a CEO, too inexperienced to see when she's being manipulated.
"I'm not being manipulated," Leslie said.
"I'm doing the job my father trained me for, which apparently includes recognizing when someone on this board has spent years quietly protecting his own interests at the company's expense. You have no authority to make accusations like that without a formal vote." "Actually," Leslie said, reaching into the folder she'd carried in with her, "I do." She slid the governance agreement across the table, the same yellowed pages Janet had handed over the night before, and watched Marsh's face change as he read the language his own predecessor had helped draft decades earlier, a provision he'd clearly forgotten existed until this exact moment. "This agreement grants the sitting CEO emergency authority to override a board vote," Leslie said, "specifically when evidence shows the founding family has been deliberately endangered to force a change in leadership. I'd say a sabotaged vehicle and a scheduled product failure designed to tank our stock qualify." The room fell into a silence heavier than any that had come before it, board members glancing between the document and Marsh, whose composure had finally, completely cracked. "This isn't over," Marsh said, though his voice had lost most of its certainty. "No," Leslie agreed. "It isn't, but it's no longer just my word against yours." Marsh didn't leave the room, but he also didn't sit back down right away, standing there with one hand braced against the table, like he needed something solid to hold on to, while the ground kept shifting beneath him. Leslie let the silence stretch a moment longer, before nodding to the man seated near the door, someone Harland hadn't been introduced to yet, gray-haired and quiet, carrying a laptop bag he set down carefully on the table.
"This is Franklin Osei,"
Leslie said. "Independent auditor, brought in this morning specifically because I knew every piece of evidence we presented would need verification from someone with no stake in this company either way." Osei didn't waste time on pleasantries. He connected his laptop to the room's display and began walking through the diagnostic files methodically, cross-checking timestamps against manufacturer records, verifying the authenticity of the security footage, frame by frame, confirming that nothing in the data had been altered or manufactured after the fact. Harland watched several board members lean forward as the auditor worked, their skepticism from 20 minutes earlier softening into something more uncertain. The sabotage pattern identified in the vehicle recovered from Mrs. Johnson, Osei said, matches, signature for signature, a set of anomalies embedded in the SUV platform's failure logs. "I've cross-referenced this against 3 independent verification methods, and I can confirm this isn't coincidence. This is deliberate, and it's consistent." "Consistent with what?" asked the woman near the middle of the table who'd challenged Leslie earlier. "Consistent with intentional manipulation designed to trigger during a specific window," Osei said. "In this case, a window that aligns precisely with your upcoming launch event." The room absorbed that for a moment, and Harland could see the shift happening in real time, faces that had been arranged in polite doubt now settling into something closer to alarm. "I'd like to run the diagnostic simulation live," Harland said, stepping forward again. "Show you exactly how this failure activates, rather than just describing it." Marsh finally spoke, though his voice had lost most of the authority it carried at the start of the meeting. "This is theater. You can make any simulation say whatever you want it to say. Then watch it happen in real time, using your own platform's actual code, pulled directly from your own servers this morning." Harland connected the terminal Leslie had prepared, and within seconds, the simulation began running through the same conditions the vehicles would face during the launch demonstration. The room watched as the dormant failure activated exactly where Harland had predicted it would. A controlled version of the same catastrophic malfunction that would have played out in front of every major outlet in the country in less than 3 weeks. Several board members exchanged glances. One of them, a woman who'd said almost nothing during the entire meeting, finally spoke up. "I want the internal authorization logs pulled again. All of them, going back 6 months, cross-referenced against every senior executive's access history." "That's already been compiled," Leslie said, sliding another folder across the table. "Every access point, every timestamp, cross-referenced against the sabotage window and the technician's forged credentials used at my mother's home." The woman opened the folder and read in silence for a long moment before looking up, this time directly at Marsh. "Whitfield, your access appears here 3 separate times, all during windows that align with the tampering." "That's absurd! Anyone could have used my credentials." "Then explain why the same access pattern also appears in the original investigation that ended Mr. Avilace's career," Osei said, checking his own copy of the records. "The timestamps match a system that, according to internal records, only you and 2 others had clearance to modify at that time." Marsh's face had gone from defensive to something closer to cornered, and Harland recognized the particular stillness of a man realizing the story he'd built was collapsing faster than he could hold it together. Another board member, silent until now, finally spoke, voice quieter than the others, but somehow carrying more weight. "Whitfield, I've sat on this board for 11 years. I've trusted your judgment through 3 different leadership transitions. I need you to tell me plainly, right now, whether any of this is true." The room waited. Marsh didn't answer immediately, and the silence itself became its own kind of confession. "I want legal counsel present before I say anything further," he finally said. "That's your right," Leslie said. "But I think everyone in this room already understands what that means." One by one, the other executives who'd been quietly aligned with Marsh throughout the morning began putting distance between themselves and him, chairs shifting, eyes avoiding his, the particular choreography of people who'd realized which way the room had turned and had no intention of going down with him. Harland had seen this exact dynamic before, 15 years ago, except then he'd been the one standing alone while everyone else quietly stepped back. Watching it happen to someone else, watching the same mechanism finally turn against the person who'd built his own success on top of it, felt less like satisfaction and more like something quieter, something closer to relief. "I'd like to formally move," said the woman who'd first questioned Leslie, "that this board suspend Mr. Marsh's authority pending a full investigation, and that we authorize whatever resources are necessary to secure the launch platform before any further failures can occur." The motion passed within minutes, votes coming quickly now, the same room that had been prepared to strip Leslie of her position an hour earlier turning unanimously in the opposite direction. Harland stood near the back again, watching Leslie's shoulders finally ease for the first time since he'd met her 3 days ago, though he knew, and he suspected she knew too, that this wasn't the end of it. Somewhere beneath Marsh, other names were still buried in those authorization logs, other people who'd known exactly what was happening and said nothing. The truth had finally surfaced. What it cost to keep it there was still an open question. The board's vote didn't end things quietly, the way Harland had half expected it might. Word of Marsh's suspension moved through the building within the hour, and by early afternoon it had already leaked past the walls of Johnson Automotive entirely, picked up by the same outlets that had run the story painting Harland as a bitter fraud days earlier. Only now the headlines had turned, and turned hard, in the opposite direction. Leslie found him in the small office where they'd spent most of the last 3 days, still surrounded by the same stacks of files, the same cold coffee cups nobody had bothered clearing away. "Legal's already pulling together everything for the criminal referral," she said, setting her phone down on the desk between them. "Marsh isn't talking, but 2 of the executives who distanced themselves in that meeting are already negotiating cooperation agreements. Apparently loyalty only goes so far once people realize which direction the consequences are heading." "Doesn't surprise me," Harland said. "Never does." There's something else. She pulled out her tablet, scrolling to a document she'd clearly been reading before she walked in. Internal audit traced the technician credentials used at my mother's house. They were issued through a third-party contractor Marsh had personally approved 8 months ago, a company that, as it turns out, doesn't actually exist beyond a shell registration and a bank account traced back to an investment group that's been quietly buying up distressed auto stock for the last year. The takeover. Exactly the takeover. If the launch had failed the way it was designed to, our stock would have dropped enough that this group could have acquired a controlling stake within days, all while looking like they were simply rescuing a company in free fall. She sat down across from him, exhaustion still etched into her face, but something steadier underneath it now. They'd have owned everything my father built, and it would have looked completely legal on paper. Harlan didn't say anything right away, thinking of his own case 15 years ago. How clean it had all looked from the outside, too. How easily a man's entire life could be dismantled by people who understood exactly which levers to pull and which paperwork to file. How far does the recall go? Every vehicle on the platform, engineering's already drafting the notice. It's going to cost the company a fortune, and it's going to happen before the launch instead of during it, which is the only reason we still have a company left to save. Better a fortune than lives. That's exactly what I told the board. She looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression that hadn't been there in their earlier conversations, something closer to genuine regard than obligation. I owe you an apology, Harlan. I accused you of trying to exploit my mother the first night we spoke. I judged you before I knew a single true thing about you. You were protecting her. I understood that, even then. Doesn't make it right. She pulled a folder from her bag, sliding it across the desk toward him. This is a formal statement from the company, along with a request to the original investigating body from 15 years ago to reopen your case. Given what we've found linking Marsh to both incidents, and given the pattern evidence Osei's already prepared to submit, legal believes there's a strong path to having your record officially cleared. Harlan stared at the folder without opening it right away, feeling something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. 15 years he'd carried that word around. Dishonest, printed in files he'd never gotten to see, repeated by people who'd never once asked him for his side of it. 15 years of watching doors close before he even got the chance to knock. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. I'm not doing it as a favor. I'm doing it because it's true, and because a company that just spent 3 days learning what happens when the truth gets buried has no business burying another one. She paused. There's also the matter of the launch itself. We're rescheduling it, once the recall's complete, and I'd like you standing beside me when we announce it publicly. Not as a mechanic we hired quietly to fix a problem, as the man who caught what an entire engineering division missed. Harlan shook his head slightly, not in refusal exactly, more in disbelief that any of this was actually unfolding the way it was. People are going to ask why a company like yours is standing next to a small-town mechanic. Then I'll tell them the truth. That the small-town mechanic is the only reason this company still exists in 3 weeks. She slid another document across the table, this one different from the others. Formal letterhead, a title he hadn't expected to see attached to his own name. I'd also like to offer you a position, senior safety consultant, reporting directly to me, full executive compensation. You'd never have to work out of that garage again if you didn't want to. Harlan looked at the offer for a long moment, turning it over in his hands, thinking about everything it represented, the vindication, the money, the chance to walk back into the world that had once thrown him out, without so much as an explanation. Then he thought about his daughter, asleep most nights by the time he finally made it home, and the shop that had been the only steady thing in both their lives since everything else fell apart. He thought about the customers who came to him, not because he was cheap, though he usually was, but because they trusted him, because he'd built something honest out of nothing when nobody expected him to build anything at all. I appreciate the offer, he said slowly, more than you know, but I don't think I want a desk on the 12th floor. Leslie studied him, surprised but not entirely. What do you want instead? Let me keep my shop. But if you need somebody independent, somebody with no stake in protecting this company's reputation, to check your platforms before they ever reach the public again, I'll do that work. On my terms, out of my garage, the way I've always done it." A slow smile crossed Leslie's face, the first real one he'd seen from her since the night she'd called demanding to know why he'd touched her mother's car. Johnson Automotive's independent safety inspector then. Officially, if you'll let us make it official. I can live with that. Outside the window, the afternoon light had turned gold across the parking lot, and for the first time in 3 days, Harland felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since long before any of this started, since a boardroom 15 years ago had decided his word wasn't worth anything at all. It was worth something now. It had always been worth something. It had just taken the right people finally being willing to listen. 6 weeks passed before Harland's shop saw its first quiet morning in longer than he could remember, which felt like the strangest part of everything that had happened. Not the recall notices that had gone out to owners across the country, not the criminal investigation into Marsh and the 2 executives who'd eventually admitted to their role once the evidence became too heavy to keep denying. Just an ordinary Tuesday, sunlight coming in low through the garage bay doors, and nobody standing there accusing him of anything. His daughter sat on the stool near his workbench, swinging her legs, watching him finish up an oil change on a car that belonged to one of his oldest customers, a woman who'd been coming to him since before any of this started and had never once stopped, not even during the week the newspapers ran his name through the mud. "Dad, is the lady still coming today?" "Which lady?" "The one with the umbrella." Harland smiled, wiping his hands on a rag. "Should be. Yeah, around noon." Janet had called 2 days earlier, said she wanted to bring the Cadillac in for its regular checkup, said it the same easy way she might have said it 6 weeks ago, like nothing about their history was unusual at all. Harland had told her she didn't need an excuse to stop by, and she'd laughed and said she knew that, but the car did need looking at regardless, so why not combine the two? She showed up a little after 11, driving herself this time, no security trailing behind her, just the same powder blue Cadillac rolling up the gravel drive under a sky clear enough that nobody needed an umbrella at all. "Mr. Aviles!" She said it the way she always did now, a little formal, a little teasing, like the title amused her as much as it embarrassed him. "Ma'am," he opened her door before she could reach for it herself. "I brought coffee, real coffee. Not whatever's been sitting in that pot of yours since morning." "That pot's fine. That pot is a war crime, and you know it." They sat together at the little table he'd set up near the front window years ago, back when business was slow enough that he needed somewhere to wait between customers that wasn't just standing around. Janet talked about her grandchildren, about a garden she was thinking of planting come spring, about anything except the 6 weeks that had just passed, and Harland understood that was deliberate, that she'd come by not to relive any of it, but simply because she liked his company, plain and uncomplicated. Leslie arrived a little after 1, dressed down for once, no suit, just jeans and a jacket that looked like it belonged to someone who'd finally gotten a full night's sleep in longer than she probably had in weeks. "Recalls 90% complete," she said, settling into the chair across from her mother. "Should be finished by the end of the month. Legal's finalizing the settlement with the affected owners, and the launch is rescheduled for 8 weeks out." "You nervous?" Harland asked. "Terrified, but it's a different kind of terrified than before." She looked at him for a moment, something warmer in her expression than the sharp suspicion she'd walked in with that first morning at his garage. "You're still coming to the relaunch." "That wasn't a request." "I remember." "Good, because we finished the paperwork this week. Officially, you're Johnson Automotive's independent safety inspector now. Contract signed, retainer included, whether or not you ever set foot on our 12th floor again." Harland felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't quite let himself feel until that exact moment. The strange, quiet relief of watching a title attach itself to his name that had nothing to do with what had been taken from him 15 years ago and everything to do with what he'd rebuilt since. Not a corner office, not a corporate badge, just his name, finally trusted again, finally worth something on paper, the way it had always been worth something to the people who actually knew him. "There's one more thing," Leslie said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a small brass plaque, simple lettering across the front. "For the shop, if you'll let us put it up." Harland read it twice before he trusted himself to speak. "Certified Independent Safety Inspector, Johnson Automotive." Nothing flashy, nothing that would have looked out of place on the wall of any ordinary business, except that it meant everything to the man standing there holding it. "You don't have to do this." "I know," Leslie said. "I'm doing it anyway." He hung it near the door himself that afternoon, right next to the faded sign that had been swinging outside since before his daughter was born, and stood back to look at both of them together, the old and the new, side by side, like they belonged to the same story, instead of two entirely different lives. Word got around fast after that, the way it always does in a town small enough that everybody knows everybody's business within a week regardless of whether it's true. By the following month, customers were lining up outside the shop again, not out of pity, not out of curiosity about the headlines that had come and gone, but because people had finally seen, plainly and undeniably, exactly who Harland Aviles had been the entire time. His daughter asked him one evening, while they closed up together, why he'd stopped for that stranded old woman in the first place, back before any of it made sense, back when helping her cost him more than he could afford to lose. Harland thought about it a long moment before answering, wiping down his tools, locking up the register for the night. "Because that's just what you do," he said. "Somebody needs help, you help them. Doesn't matter what it costs you. Doesn't matter if anybody ever finds out. Even if it's scary?" Especially then. She seemed satisfied with that, the way kids often are, with answers simpler than the truth actually deserves. And together, they turned off the shop lights and stepped out into an evening that smelled like rain again, though this time nothing about the weather worried him at all. Somewhere down the road, another car would break down eventually, another stranger would need somebody willing to stop when everyone else kept driving, and Harland already knew exactly what he'd do when that day came. He'd pull over, he always would. Not because of what it had earned him this time, but because it was who he'd always been, long before anyone thought to notice. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story meant something to you, I'd really love for you to subscribe. Before you go, leave a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read your comments, and I always enjoy seeing your thoughts and perspectives. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, just tap the next video on your screen. I'll see you there.